Hi, everyone. Now that paper one has been submitted, we're going to start talking about paper two. Before viewing this lecture, you should have already looked at the assignment sheet for major paper two, which is a rhetorical analysis. This week, we will talk about the first half of the rhetorical analysis, as well as how to select a topic, things like that. Like I said, it is helpful if you've already looked at the assignment sheet, but it's also okay if you haven't, and you want to watch the lesson and then look at the assignment sheet after. Let's get started. So first of all, why are we even doing a rhetorical analysis? Before we start talking about what it is, let's talk about why we're doing it. The first thing is that this can help us build upon our critical analytical skills and create some new ones. Learning how to analyze something out there that's already existing and a message that's already being put out there, even if it's for entertainment, helps us. We'll analyze sources for our future papers. It can analyze how we form and approach arguments by seeing how others are constructing their arguments, or how all the messages are constructed around us can help us form or learn how to construct our own. And also because we live in a very media-driven culture. We are constantly bombarded by messages and arguments. I mean, last night was the Super Bowl, and one of the things people look forward to every year are Super Bowl commercials because of the power of advertising. We're surrounded by the messages in advertisements as well as other things constantly. By learning how to decipher and understand the deeper meanings of the messages around us, we become more aware consumers. So this is a screenshot from an older Old Spice commercial. I feel like in the newer commercials, they're trying to get away from this idea of in order to be masculine, you have to have these things. But at the time when these commercials were being done, it was this idea that you have to, in order to be a real man, you need to smell like this, and Old Spice will help you be more masculine. So we're going to talk about how different elements come together to form the message and things like that in order to understand how messages like this Old Spice one exist. Again, this one is talking about these ideas of masculinity and how to perform gender, how to perform masculinity, how to appear masculine and appealing to others. Here, primarily the opposite sex, I would say, but not always. And of course, the purpose behind it is to sell their product. You'll be reading more about this for homework or for online assignments this week, so that should help clarify it a bit. So let's talk about what rhetorical analysis is, and then we'll start breaking it down now that we know why we're doing it. Sorry, I have to open a drink. My voice is very dry today. So let's look at what it means. Rhetorical analysis comes out of the genre of writing called rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, or basically using language to form an argument. I would suggest here to think about language in two different ways. The language we either hear or read or both, as well as how visual elements with whatever we're writing our rhetorical analysis on, whatever you choose, and we'll talk about choosing your artifact in a minute, how the visual elements are also part of that same language. You're going to want to look at visual elements as well. The word analysis means to break down or a detailed examination of the elements or pieces of something, how the pieces are put together, how these pieces are. So rhetorical analysis means to look at the parts of a media artifact or something from the media in order to understand or decipher its underlying message. Rhetoric comes from Aristotle, and we will talk about him a lot, especially next week. This idea of using language to persuade, and we're going to look at how this is used in something existing that you find from the media that connects to your semester project. or semester topic. Here, when we're talking about artifact, we're not talking about an artifact like we think of as like something that an archaeologist would find, like a sculpture or a piece of art. Here, instead, artifact is just a piece of media, a piece of the media that is connecting to your semester topic. It should be something that has a visual and textual elements. So a song that has a music video. So you would look at the lyrics and the music video together, a video, an episode of television, a scene from a movie or a storyline from a movie, advertisements, YouTube videos. This says news stories are okay. I would recommend looking for news stories as your last resort because I want to really focus on how these maybe sometimes how messages are out there that we don't seem as obvious. But if you can't find one of these other types of artifacts, then a news story is okay. Regardless, you want to make sure that it somehow connects to your semester topic, and it needs to be somewhat short. In other words, probably a storyline from a movie instead of an entire film, so that you can have the time to really dive into it. Long enough where it has enough to analyze, short enough to where you can really look at the pieces of it within the space of the assignment rather than an entire film, in other words. The rhetorical analysis is going to be in 3 different sections. You'll have your introduction, then you'll have the first major section of the paper, the rhetorical situation, which is what we're going to talk about today. Then you'll have the second section, which is the second biggest part, and then the conclusion, and some other things that come along with APA formatting. Today, we're just focusing on the first big section of the paper, which is the rhetorical situation. Again, this is the first section of the analysis, and we're looking at the context or surrounding situation of the artifact. So if you see this picture here, there's the building inside. The building inside would be the message itself. The cage around it, this dome, would be the rhetorical situation. So we're not yet really necessarily looking at the argument itself or how it's constructed. We're looking at everything surrounding it, the context around it. Is it meeting a need? Is there a social issue? What's behind the creation? And we'll talk about the different aspects as well. We're going to look at this in 5 different parts: the speaker, the subject, exigence, audience, and constraints. I would say primarily all of these would most likely need to have their own paragraph in your rhetorical analysis. So this section, you would have at least 5 paragraphs. Some of these could go together, subject and speaker sometimes, things like that. But you want to make sure you at least address all 5 of them with evidence from the text that you're using, whether that's a visual text or a video text or a written text. First thing we're going to talk about is the speaker. The speaker is in 2 different sections depending on how it's together, who's creating it. So if I'm looking at an episode of a television series, I may need to look at the showrunner and the person who wrote the episode, maybe the director if I'm looking at some visual elements, things like that. And then also who is speaking the message. So if I'm looking again at a television show, I'd also need to look at the character who is speaking. This character is a character who's appeared in one episode or all of the episodes, and what difference does that mean? How does that add to the message? Who is the one speaking it, and who came up with what they're speaking? That's really important context when you get into, especially when we start talking about the second section. When you start talking about credibility, then it's good to already, so your reader already has some idea of who's creating it and who's the one speaking. So if I'm looking at the first Captain America comic, for an example, and we'll look at this. This is the first cover of the very first Captain America comic, came out in it was published in 1941, and it was created by, so the speaker is going to be in 2 different sections here. The creators are Joe Simon, or sorry, Joe Simon and I can't remember the other one right offhand. Sorry. So I would need to talk about both of those, the people that wrote it, and a little bit of their background. So they are Jewish American immigrants, and they are creating a comic character. That's the speaker, that's the creator. We're not talking about why yet. We're just talking about who's doing it. I would also talk about the speaker here being Captain America himself, the character, um, who he is, what he represents, things like that. If I'm looking at the ASPCA, this advertisement right here is a screenshot of a video from the ASPCA, and I would talk about who the ASPCA is. They're an organization that talks about taking care of animals, justice for animals, shelter, safety, raising money for adoptions, things like that. Just what background does a speaker need to have? This commercial too, I believe, had a video, the song that was overlaying it, and the speaker as well was Sarah McLachlan. So I need to talk about who she is as a singer and performer. After I talk about the speaker, then I'm going to say, what is the subject? What is the evidence? Like, what is the message that's trying to be created? What argument or message are they trying to get across? I'm not going to, and then is it effective? I'm not going to evaluate why it's not effective, but I will tell my readers, this is the message. This is how I know this is the message. So I'm going to use evidence to support it. And I'm going to then say it's effective. You can also put this a little bit in the introduction as well. The thesis statement, when we talk about that, would need to have what the subject is, things like that. So, Captain America, the message behind this is that at the time he was created, so the United States would get into World War II, and we'll talk about that with exigence. But the message itself is that we should stand up to Hitler and Nazism. And I know this is the message because the cover has Captain America, who we know is the hero or the good guy of this comic. He's the protagonist, punching the antagonist or the enemy, who's a cartoon of Hitler, in the face. That's the message. That we should stand up and face down Nazism. And the evidence would be, again, these things that I see from the cover. ASPCA, the message is that we should donate to make sure these animals are not going hungry. I know this is the message because there is a donate button literally right here. So it's the purpose it exists, to get donations. And the words, don't let them go hungry. And I know it's talking about animals because there's a really, really cute puppy right here who is begging me with his eyes to give him food. And he has an empty bowl, things like that. So with both of these, when I'm using evidence to say this is how I know this is the message, I'm looking at the words here as well as visual elements. Keep that in mind. Let's talk then about exigence. This is a part that gets where we start doing a little bit more writing. The other two are pretty short. Exigence is why is this whole thing exists, what's going on in the world around this artifact, this piece of media that it's responding to. What is going on around it? Why does this thing exist? So thinking about the Super Bowl halftime show from last night, Kendrick Lamar performing Not Like Us is significant because, or the exigence there is significant because it's responding to some allegations against Drake, and it's coming out of a beef the two rappers have with each other where they were trading insults with their songs. Kendrick Lamar just happened to do it more successfully. So what's going on around it? This can be, why is the creator or speaker motivated to create this? What is going on in the world outside this that's causing it to exist? You're going to use some outside research for this, most likely. When I say most likely, I mean, I can't think of very many situations where you wouldn't need to. Maybe you need to look up an interview, things like that. The creator of Steven Universe, Rebecca Sugar. They created Steven Universe to bring about representation in stories that Rebecca Sugar did not have growing up. they wish they'd had growing up, so they created a cartoon to meet that need for them. I would learn that by looking up interviews. Why was this created? Is there a social issue? Is it addressing something like inequality? Things like that. Is it about meeting a need economically or structurally? Is it trying to meet a need in the audience? And we'll talk about that when we talk about audience. Is there something that's missing in the media landscape that this is trying to fill? Why are they doing it? So, Captain America. I mentioned before who created it. The reason they created Captain America is because at the time the United States was not yet involved in World War II. As children of Jewish immigrants, they realize that they are not hearing from their family members in Europe anymore. At this time, we're hearing tales of the Holocaust, things that are going on at that time period. And they created this character, Captain America, who looks like the American ideal. He's very patriotic. He's literally wearing red, white, and blue. At the same time, when he's not in costume, Captain America also is blonde hair, blue eyed, looks like Hitler's ideal human that he wanted to create. And he's punching Hitler in the face. So they created a character to address the social need that we need to get involved. I know this because I can look at what's going on in the world in the time period that it was created. So I need to look at when this thing was created. But also, I can read interviews by the creators. There's been a lot written about it. So I would look up, why was Captain America created? Why is Captain America punching Hitler? Things like that. So you're going to do some research behind this to find out why. ASPCA. This advertisement was created to address the need for food in shelters. It comes out, this Don't Let Them Go Hungry campaign came out of a need to address the fact that often things like dog and cat toys will get donated to shelters, towels, blankets, all of these things. But when it comes to food, often that's not. Or if it is, it's maybe not the type of food that the shelters themselves need. Maybe they have animals with particular diets. So they created this way to not just drop off food, but to also donate money to go toward food so that the dog's diets, or the dog in this case, but all shelter animals, their specific dietary needs could be met. I know this because of the context, again, within the advertisement itself or the artifact itself that I'm looking at, but also because I've done some research to find out why did they do this particular Don't Let Them Go Hungry campaign. And there will be readings to go along with exigence. I'm going to give you readings for exigence, audience, and constraints, things like that this week. Once you've talked about the exigence or why this is created, then you need to talk about the audience. Who is this created for? Who can respond to the message of the artifact? They should be able to either address it if there's a need, or they should benefit from the message. This can determine the audience, the type of language that's used, how formal the discourse is, and the medium of its delivery. In other words, if it's for kids, it may be in simpler words, brighter colors. If it's for adults, there may be some profanity, but if it's for kids, no profanity. Are there scare tactics being used? Who should be scared? If you don't do this, then this will happen. Things like that. How do I know who the audience is? In order to understand that, I'm going to look at what does it look like, the visual elements, and then I'm going to look at, so like if it's animation, for example, cartoons for adults have a lot more complex use of color, maybe less contrast or bright contrast. If there's a fight, there's going to be blood, things like that. If it's for a child, even if it's still animation, still the same medium, there's probably not blood. Or if there is, it's very small and obviously cartoonish. The animation is usually simpler, the drawings are simpler, the colors are brighter, things like that. Looking at Captain America, the intended audience are Americans. I know this because it was only produced in America. At the time, it was only produced in the United States. Comics had a much smaller run back then than they do now, obviously. And it's also people who maybe are not convinced the United States should get involved. I know this because I've maybe done some reading, so I know that's who they intended it for. Um, Things like that. At the time, comics were for a younger audience, so I maybe look at like how does this appeal to kids? There's not, the fight itself. There's like an explosion looking thing, things like that, instead of like a bloody beating to a pulp. Things like that. I would also look at things like Captain America's youngest ally, Bucky, way before Winter Soldier time here, folks. So I would assume that he's appealing to a younger audience because they're also introducing a young ally. ASPCA and the intended audience are people with money because they're asking for money. So I know that their audience is people who want to donate. And it's for people who care about pets and animals. Because if you don't really care about what they're giving out or the message, if you don't care about the animal here, then the cutest animal in the world is not going to make you care. Things like that. And then we come to constraints, which is the last section of, sorry, I don't know what's wrong with my computer. I need to start doing this at work again. Um, Constraints are limitations. This is the last section or the last thing you'll talk about in the first section, the rhetorical situation. After you do the constraints, then you're ready to start getting a hold of, start looking at the message itself. But before we look at the message, we're going to look at the limitations of it. What could interfere with the audience responding to the message of the artifact? It could be the type of artifact it is. It could be that maybe a serious audience is going to respond to a comic book, for example. It could be how long it is. Constraints of if I'm looking at a song, especially if it's a radio edit or a single version, then a constraint could be that they have to get a whole message out in roughly 3.5 minutes. How much space do they have to create it? If it's an advertisement and it's a print ad, it has to have all of its messaging in one page. What are the requirements of the network or the time it comes on? If it's a television episode, depending on the network, if it's cable, if it's streaming, if it's or broadcast, there's going to be different restrictions on what they can get away with, the language they can use, the amount of violence, things like that. And sometimes the beliefs or attitudes of the creator can get in its own way. So they can have a message they care about so much that they want to get across that they don't consider is the audience going to benefit from this. Um, Thinking back to the television series Glee, for example, there were times there where they wanted to put like where they really were trying to promote diversity, and it was really great, except sometimes they would create characters just to fit into these things they wanted to talk about, and they weren't very organic characters, and they came across like stereotypes. That was a constraint on how effective that argument was. Um, there were also things like maybe the audience, there's a limitation or constraint the audience themselves. The audience maybe has to know certain things to understand the context. So if I'm looking at the Super Bowl performance from last night and I don't know anything about Drake and Kendrick Lamar and their beef, then I'm not going to understand the significance of lines like trying to strike a chord and it's probably A minor, which is poetry, by the way. Captain America, when it came out at the time, color was a limitation. There were only certain colors that could be used to that could be printed because of the different mediums of printing at the time. So the colors that could be used in the comics became a limitation. Availability was a limitation at the time. Corner stores in more urban areas had comics. More rural areas did not. There's a limitation. Um, there's only so many words you can fit on a page of a comic. Most of the language in comics is visual. So that becomes a limitation or a constraint. How can I get my message across effectively in very few words? The ASPCA commercial, these are very short, targeted ads, especially this movement here. This campaign was meant to be a YouTube advertisement. The longest advertisement on YouTube, typically, we're going to ignore the longer ones that are popping up now, typically are 30 seconds or less. But also, people tend to only watch the first 15 seconds of an advertisement until they can skip it to watch their video. So you have to, so that time becomes a constraint. The constraint could also be that their audience has to be people who can donate. So maybe a younger audience that is going to be upset over the sad puppy, but maybe they don't have the money to respond to it. So that could be a constraint. So just in review, when we're talking about the rhetorical situation, we're looking at context. Who's creating this artifact? Who's speaking? Are they the best speaker? Are they the best creator? Those are things you want to think about. What is the message itself? How do you know that's the message? Is it effective? We're not going to evaluate why or why not it's effective yet, but you can talk about what makes it effective or not. And then you're going to look at the exigence or what it's responding to. Is there something going on in the world around it? Is there a big social issue? Is there a pressing issue? Um, what's the motivation for creating it? Then we're going to look at the audience or who is this intended for and the constraints or the limitations behind it. As always, if you have any questions um, about anything that we talked about today or this, please send me an email. And I am looking forward to hearing from you and happy writing.